the winter of 1939, the Soviet Union launched a military operation against Finland that its own planners expected to conclude within 12 days. The Red Army outnumbered Finnish forces by a ratio that, on paper, made the outcome seem foregone. Soviet artillery alone exceeded the entire Finnish regular army in terms of personnel. And yet, by the time the fighting ended in March 1940, Finland had not been conquered. The Soviet Union had paid a price in blood and materiel that stunned military observers from Berlin to Washington. What made that possible was not found on the battlefield. It was built into the decisions made long before the first shot was fired. The Soviet Union in 1939 was a military power in the middle of a profound internal crisis that it could not acknowledge publicly. The Great Purge of 1937 and 1938 had removed an estimated 35,000 officers from the Red Army, including 3 of the 5 marshals, 13 of the 15 army commanders, and 50 of the 57 corps commanders. These were not merely administrative removals. Many were executed. Others were imprisoned. The effect on institutional knowledge, on the chain of command, on the culture of honest operational reporting was catastrophic. Officers who survived learned a specific lesson. Do not contradict the expectations of those above you. Do not report bad news in terms that suggest incompetence at the top. Do not revise an optimistic estimate downward once it has been approved by political leadership. This lesson, absorbed quietly across thousands of headquarters and command posts, would shape every decision made during the coming Finnish campaign. Stalin himself was not a man who tolerated unwelcome assessments. His intervention in military affairs had grown dramatically across the 1930s, and by 1939 he was personally involved in strategic planning in a way that made independent military judgment functionally dangerous. When Soviet intelligence produced estimates of Finnish military capability before the war, those estimates were systematically low. Finnish reserves were underreported. Finnish defensive preparation was assessed as superficial. The terrain was described in ways that minimized its operational significance. None of this happened because Soviet intelligence was incompetent in the abstract. It happened because the system surrounding that intelligence had learned to produce conclusions that matched what leadership wanted to hear. Finland in 1939 was a small country by most measures. Its population was just under 4 million. Its defense budget was limited. Its army in peacetime was small, built around a cadre structure that relied on rapid mobilization of trained reservists. But Finland had several characteristics that made it a far more difficult military target than Soviet planning acknowledged. The country's southern border, the Karelian Isthmus, was narrow, heavily forested, and deeply unsuited to the kind of large-scale armored and motorized operations the Red Army was beginning to theorize about. Across that isthmus, Finland had constructed a network of fortifications known as the Mannerheim Line, named after the country's commander-in-chief, Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim. The line was not, contrary to some Soviet assessments, a continuous concrete wall of impenetrable bunkers. It was a layered system of field fortifications, pre-sighted artillery positions, anti-tank obstacles, and prepared defensive terrain. Its strength came not from the density of any single feature, but from how each element supported the others. Finnish defenders knew the ground. They had trained on it. They had built their tactical doctrine around it. Mannerheim himself was 72 years old when the war began, a former officer of the Imperial Russian Army who had served the Tsar and then led Finland through its own civil war in 1918. He was methodical, unsentimental, and deeply skeptical of political optimism. His military approach emphasized economy of force, defensive depth, and preserving the capacity to counterattack. He was not without his own illusions, but he was far more calibrated than his Soviet counterparts about what Finnish forces could realistically accomplish. He knew Finland could not win a prolonged war of attrition against the Soviet Union. His goal was to extract a cost high enough and hold long enough to make a negotiated outcome politically viable. Whether that goal could be achieved depended entirely on how Soviet operations unfolded. The war began on November 30, 1939, following a period of failed diplomatic negotiations in which the Soviet Union had demanded significant territorial concessions from Finland, including parts of the Karelian Isthmus and the lease of the Hanko Peninsula for use as a naval base. Finland rejected the final terms. Soviet forces crossed the border along multiple axes simultaneously, from the Karelian Isthmus in the south to the vast forests of central and northern Finland. The operation was described internally as a campaign that would be finished before winter had fully settled in. 12 days was the estimate circulating in some Soviet planning documents. Others suggested it might take 3 weeks. What those estimates rested on reveals the first of the 3 mistakes in clearest form. The first mistake was not tactical, it was epistemic. Stalin and the Soviet military leadership went to war against a Finland they had constructed in their assessments, rather than the Finland that actually existed. This distinction matters because it shaped every operational decision that followed, from the order of battle to the logistics chain to the pace of advance expected from frontline commanders. Soviet planners had access to information about Finnish terrain. The Karelian Isthmus appeared on maps. Aerial reconnaissance had been conducted. Finnish military literature, though limited, was not entirely unknown to Soviet intelligence analysts. The problem was not the absence of information, but the filtration of it. Reports that confirmed a rapid campaign were elevated. Reports that complicated the picture were revised, qualified, or suppressed at successive levels of the command hierarchy before reaching the people making final decisions. By the time operational plans were approved, they reflected a version of Finland where the terrain was manageable, the fortifications were limited, the reserves were slow, and the population would greet Soviet forces with, at minimum, political ambivalence. None of this was accurate. The terrain on the Karelian Isthmus was a system of lakes, forests, and frozen marshes that channeled armored movement onto predictable routes. Off those routes, heavy equipment bogged down, lost cohesion, and became vulnerable. The forests that extended through central and northern Finland were not background scenery. They were an active military environment where small Finnish infantry units, moving on skis, could operate at speeds and in conditions that Soviet forces, largely untrained for winter forest warfare, could not match. Finnish mobilization was faster than estimated, Finnish reserves more numerous, and Finnish tactical discipline at the small unit level was a product of years of deliberate preparation by officers who understood exactly what kind of war they would have to fight. The immediate result of these mistaken assumptions was a command structure that had set expectations impossible to meet. Soviet division commanders on the Karelian Isthmus launched frontal assaults against positions they had been told were lightly held, with artillery schedules calibrated for an advance that stalled within days. When assaults failed, the reporting chain faced a familiar dilemma: deliver an accurate account that implicated poor planning at the top, or describe the situation in terms that preserved the illusion of forward progress while requesting more resources. In most cases, the latter prevailed. This meant that the commanders above were receiving information that didn't correspond to conditions on the ground, which led to follow-on orders that made the situation worse. The second mistake grew out of the first, but operated at a different level of the system. It was a doctrinal mistake, and it manifested most visibly in how Soviet forces were structured and employed in conditions they were not prepared for. The Red Army of 1939 had been developing mechanized doctrine, influenced partly by Western theorists and partly by its own experience in the Spanish Civil War and the battles at Khalkhin Gol against Japan in 1939. The Khalkhin Gol operation, led by Georgy Zhukov, had been a successful large-scale combined arms engagement on open, semi-arid terrain in Manchuria. It had reinforced a set of ideas about the value of armor, motorized infantry, and coordinated artillery in offensive operations. These ideas were not wrong in the abstract, but they were deeply terrain-specific, and the people applying them to Finland did not adequately interrogate that specificity. On the Karelian Isthmus and in the forests beyond it, Soviet tanks were employed in ways that negated their advantages and amplified their vulnerabilities. Armor was sent forward on roads and frozen lake surfaces because the forests and marshes offered no alternative. Finnish anti-tank defences were concentrated at exactly those points. Finnish infantry, armed with a combination of anti-tank guns, improvised incendiary devices, and familiarity with the terrain, was able to attack the tanks from angles and distances that armoured doctrine had not adequately accounted for. Soviet tank crews were not trained to operate effectively in close terrain without infantry support. Soviet infantry, for its part, was often unable to keep pace with armour in deep snow and was not equipped or trained for the conditions it encountered. The result was a series of engagements in which Soviet mechanized forces found themselves isolated, their logistics cut, their flanks exposed to Finnish ski troops moving through terrain the Soviets could not follow. The most acute example of this pattern occurred not on the Karelian Isthmus, but in the central Finnish forests, where entire Soviet divisions were encircled and destroyed in engagements that became known by the Finnish term moti, meaning a cubic meter of firewood, used to describe the chopped-up Soviet formations left isolated in the forest. The 44th Division, the 18th Division, and others suffered catastrophic losses not because Finnish forces were numerically superior, but because Soviet operational structure placed those divisions in positions where their doctrine offered no solutions. This doctrinal failure had a specific institutional dimension. The purge of senior officers had removed many of the people who might have had the experience and authority to question whether existing doctrine was appropriate for Finnish conditions before the campaign began. Those who remained were operating under enormous pressure to demonstrate results. Raising doctrinal objections in the pre-war planning phase would have required a kind of institutional confidence that the purge had systematically eliminated. The mistake was therefore not simply one of military theory. It was a mistake enabled by the destruction of the professional culture in which such questions would normally have been asked and answered before the fighting started. There is a third layer to this that has not yet been addressed, one that sits above both the epistemic failure and the doctrinal one, and that would prove in some ways the most consequential of the three. The third mistake was political, and it preceded the war itself. Stalin chose to fight Finland in a way that locked him into a strategic position from which there was no clean exit, and he did so without fully accounting for what that position would cost once the military campaign began to fail. In the days before the Soviet invasion, a parallel structure was put in place that revealed the political logic behind the operation. On November 30th, the same day Soviet forces crossed the border, the Soviet Union announced the formation of a new Finnish government, the Finnish Democratic Republic, headquartered in the border town of Terijoki on territory the Red Army had just captured. This government was led by Otto Ville Kuusinen, a Finnish communist who had lived in the Soviet Union since 1918. Within days, this Terijoki government signed an agreement ceding the territorial demands the real Finnish government had refused, and the Soviet Union formally recognized it as the legitimate government of Finland. The purpose of this construction was transparent to every observer with any knowledge of Soviet political practice, but its strategic implications extended beyond the obvious cynicism of the arrangement. By creating the Terijoki government and recognizing it, Stalin had defined the war's objective not as territorial adjustment, but as regime change. The campaign was no longer simply about acquiring the Karelian Isthmus and Hanko. It was about installing a new government. This meant that any outcome short of Finnish capitulation and the establishment of the Kuusinen government as the effective ruler of Finland was, by definition, a political failure. There was no intermediate diplomatic resting point. There was no negotiated territorial settlement that Stalin could accept without publicly abandoning the premise on which the entire operation had been constructed. This political commitment interacted with the military failures in a way that made each problem harder to solve. When the initial offensive stalled in December 1939, the question was not only how to fix the military situation, but how to do so in a context where the political objectives were fixed and publicly declared. Pulling back and negotiating with the Ritti government in Helsinki, the actual Finnish government, would require dissolving the Terijoki fiction and acknowledging that the Soviet Union had constructed a puppet administration that it was now abandoning. That was politically untenable, at least in the short term. So the war continued while the military situation deteriorated. The international dimension compounded the problem further. The League of Nations, already a weakened institution, took the unusual step of expelling the Soviet Union in December 1939, only the second time in its history that it had expelled a member state. This had limited practical effect on Soviet military capacity, but it crystallized the diplomatic isolation that the Terijoki decision had accelerated. Britain and France began discussing the possibility of military intervention on Finland's behalf, not necessarily out of deep commitment to Finnish sovereignty, but out of strategic interest in opening a northern front and potentially threatening Soviet oil supplies. The possibility of direct great power involvement, remote as it eventually proved, added pressure to a Soviet leadership already absorbing the shock of military setbacks it had not anticipated. Inside Finland, the Terijoki government produced an effect precisely opposite to what Soviet planners had imagined. Rather than fragmenting Finnish political resolve by offering a ready-made alternative authority, it unified the Finnish population with a clarity that would have been harder to achieve through any other means. The Finnish left, which might otherwise have been a point of political pressure, had no credible reason to embrace a government that was visibly a Soviet creation installed on occupied Finnish soil. Finnish labor unions, Finnish communists who had remained in Finland, and ordinary Finnish workers who might have harbored grievances against the political establishment were given a choice between their country and a government that arrived behind foreign tanks. The choice was not difficult. Finnish social cohesion during the Winter War was not an accident of culture. It was partly a product of the political mistake Stalin had made in announcing the Terijoki government before his army had demonstrated it could actually reach Helsinki. The reorganization that the Soviet military undertook in January 1940 addressed the operational dimensions of the problem with considerable competence, which makes the preceding months all the more striking in contrast. Kirill Meretskov, who had commanded the Leningrad military district during the initial offensive, was replaced by Semyon Timoshenko, who set about restructuring Soviet forces on the Karelian Isthmus with methodical urgency. New training was instituted for winter conditions. Artillery was massed at levels that represented a significant logistical achievement. Infantry armor cooperation was drilled under conditions closer to what troops would actually encounter. The assault that began on February 11, 1940, was a different operation from the one that had failed in December, more deliberate, better prepared, and more honest in its planning assumptions about what the terrain actually required. The Mannerheim Line broke under sustained bombardment over several weeks. Finnish reserves, which had been fighting continuously since November, were being consumed at a rate the country could not sustain indefinitely. The defensive depth that Mannerheim had counted on was compressing. Towns that had been held through December and January were falling. Finnish ammunition stocks, particularly artillery shells, were running critically low. By late February, Mannerheim was advising the Finnish government that the military situation had moved beyond the point where further resistance could be sustained without relief from outside, and the prospect of meaningful outside relief had not materialized. The line did not collapse all at once. Individual Finnish units continued to fight with exceptional tactical discipline even as the operational picture deteriorated. Soviet forces crossing the ice of Viipuri Bay in late February and early March threatened to outflank the entire remaining defensive position and compelled Finnish commanders to make choices about where to commit their last coherent reserves. The pressure at that point was not tactical, it was existential in the precise military sense. The question was whether the Finnish army could maintain organized resistance long enough for a ceasefire to be negotiated before the force itself ceased to be capable of doing so. Peace negotiations began in Moscow in early March 1940, with Sweden serving as an intermediary to open the initial channel. The Finnish delegation knew the terms would be severe. They were: the Moscow Peace Treaty, signed on March 13, 1940, transferred the Karelian Isthmus, the city of Vyborg, and other territories to the Soviet Union. Finland also ceded the Hanko Peninsula on a 30-year lease. The Terijoki government vanished without formal ceremony. Kuusinen was absorbed back into Soviet institutional life, eventually becoming a significant figure in party administration. No official explanation was offered for why the government that had been recognized with such ceremony in November no longer existed by March. The territorial cost to Finland was significant. Approximately 11% of Finnish territory changed hands, and around 400,000 Finns who had lived in the ceded areas were resettled inside the new border. The process was dislocating and painful, managed under enormous logistical strain. But Finland's government remained in Helsinki. Its army, battered and short of ammunition, remained an organized force. Its political institutions continued to function. The Soviet Union had achieved the territorial objectives it had demanded before the war started. It had not installed the Kuusinen government. It had not obtained a compliant neighbor. The 3 months of fighting had cost the Red Army losses that remained subject to historical debate, but by most serious estimates exceeded 125,000 killed, with total casualties including wounded and captured considerably higher. Finnish military deaths were around 25,000. The ratio did not reflect a balanced exchange between two comparable forces. It reflected the cumulative effect of 3 mistakes operating simultaneously across the entire Soviet campaign. Military observers in Germany drew their own conclusions from what they had watched. The performance of the Red Army in Finland contributed to calculations about Soviet military capacity that would factor, among many other inputs, into planning for Operation Barbarossa the following year. Whether those conclusions were accurate, or whether they overread a campaign that the Soviets had ultimately managed to bring to a successful territorial conclusion, is a question historians have worked on for decades without reaching full agreement. What is not in dispute is the more contained and verifiable record. The Mannerheim Line had been broken, the treaty had been signed. The men who had held the line at Suma and Kola and in the frozen forests near Suomussalmi returned to what remained of their country. At the village of Suomussalmi, where the Soviet 44th Division had been destroyed in encirclement, the forest in winter holds a particular kind of silence. The trees are the same trees. The cold is the same cold that stopped vehicles and froze weapons and made every calculation made in warm offices in Leningrad and Moscow into something abstract and incorrect. The men who fought there, on both sides, left no monuments to mistake or miscalculation. They left only the ground, still there, still the same, still telling the same thing to anyone willing to read it carefully enough.